Good morning, everyone. My name is Tessa Boerman, and I have the honor to moderate today's talk with Zahra Rasool. She's head of contrast at Al Jazeera. Although I'm just a moderator, and I do hope you have a lot of questions, I'll be very happy to have a conversation also with Zahra, because her thinking comes from a very profound understanding of what storytelling is and what storytelling could be in a changing world. So I would very much like to invite you and listen to Zahra Rasool, and you have opportunities to ask questions later. Please, the floor is yours, Zahra.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for having me here today. Before I begin addressing the topic for my talk today, I want to show you a short video that highlights the kind of work me and my team cover at Contrast. So Contrast is actually Al Jazeera's innovation studio. We look at new and emerging tech and how we can use that for more innovative storytelling and journalism. And here's the video.
I wish I could be a pharmacist so I can give everything I have to making Syria better.
After 7 years of war, these are the stories they want to tell.
Of course, that video was meant to be watched in VR and 360, hence the format. So most of the references in this talk today draw upon my experience working as a journalist in American newsrooms. However, I do think that the issues I raise are relevant to a European context and to the broader documentary and film industry as well. I've been working as a documentary journalist for the past 8 years, and while I absolutely love what I do, I'm also conflicted at times about the purpose of the stories we tell as a global news industry. By this I mean, along this journey, I've had to constantly ask myself, who are our stories really for? I recently shared a stage with Michael Denzel Smith, a black writer from the US. He talks about a few things which I think are critical for reframing the conversation about diversity and representation. Namely, the diversity in the media and storytelling is truly a social justice issue. Can we go to the next? No, there's one. When we consider that media organizations and storytellers have been getting the story wrong when it comes to representing certain communities and the issues impacting them, the form of justice needed is not for the same people to tell the stories. Rather, it is the ownership of those stories by the people who've been lied about and their opportunity to tell their truth. Because we all know how important the media is and the role that stories play in shaping conversations that have the potential to change policy, or on the other hand, to misinform or elevate prejudices. Within immersive media and early virtual reality stories, our industry began with the impetus of taking an audience to where they had never or could never go. In some cases, this meant adventurous destinations like the sky or the bottom of the ocean. But for coverage of global and pressing issues, it also meant refugee camps or the front lines of war zones. Now, several years later, even in cases where immersive stories take place in seemingly everyday locations, such as an airport, the stories have often centered around bringing a Western and white audience into someone else's experience. A few months back, I watched an augmented reality project called Terminal 3 that shows the hurdles many Muslims face when entering the US.
There's something wrong with the
Sure. It's a powerful project, and I would highly recommend watching it if you're privileged with an identity and passport that doesn't cause you anxiety every time you go through immigration. However, the AR experience of Terminal 3 was all too familiar for me. Given my Indian passport and my Muslim identity, it is what I often face while entering the US, which is my current residence. I definitely wasn't the intended audience for the project. A majority of the stories, even when they're about issues impacting people in the global south or minority communities in the West, are made with the intention of showing those experiences to a Western audience. Throughout this year, I've spoken at length on how, within immersive media, most of the stories being told are about developing countries and communities of color. But most of the time, these stories are being told by people who don't come from those communities and are rarely for those communities. Too often, these stories are being told in ways that are inaccurate or inauthentic. I've also previously outlined 3 core ways we at Contrast try to make more authentic stories. First is collaborating with the community and working with locals. Second is hiring a diverse team. And third, advocating for diverse perspectives. As advances in technology and distribution enable us to create innovative and immersive stories, it also possesses the danger to exploit and further marginalize underrepresented communities. Today, I'd like to push this conversation to both consider the justice and another aspect of telling authentic stories, the audience. With the public's trust in mainstream media is on a decline globally, in the US, minority communities have had a long history of distrust in the media. According to a report published in 2014, when Black people were asked whether they thought news about their communities was accurate, 75% of Blacks said only moderately, or slightly, or not at all. 3/4 of African American news consumers and 2/3 of Hispanics have doubts about what mainstream media reports about their communities. Recently, when my team was in the field in Rio de Janeiro, supporting 10 storytellers from the favelas in making VR films, one of the participants shared that members of her community have a complicated relationship with journalists. She said that when residents of the favela see a local journalist that's covering a story, they have greater trust that the narrative won't be stereotyped or told in a distorted way. But when there's a journalist from the outside, there's a relationship of fear and even revolt, as favelas and their residents are almost always depicted as marginalized by the corporate media. What would happen if journalists covering the favelas from the outside considered the possibility that their audience also consists of readers from the very favelas in Rio? I've advocated that the answer lies in more diverse newsrooms and more diverse teams of storytellers. And I think this is even further buttressed when we understand that more diverse teams open up so many more possibilities when it comes to the coverage and the audience. The lack of diversity in newsrooms has a huge impact on what kinds of coverage is being done and how this coverage often fails to engage certain audience demographics and build trust in the media from those communities. This matters not just because it's in the best interest of media platforms to diversify their audience, but more significantly because they demonstrate massive blind spots in the content and how certain stories are being told. As I mentioned earlier, if an immersive story about custom interrogations is created for one demographic of an audience and not another, how do we create stories that consider the diversity of the audience? Well, I think we need to think more about the distribution of our work too. Here I'll speak to trends we're observing about the VR industry as we're gaining more and more data about how the industry is developing. Studies show that most of the revenue generated by the VR industry is coming from the Americas, with the highest market growth expected in the Asia Pacific, and some of the least developed regions for the industry being in the Middle East and Africa. Arabic digital content only accounts for 0.162% of the total digital content online. However, connectivity in the developing countries is on the rise. One of my colleagues did a workshop in Istanbul for a group of majority of Arabs, where she saw firsthand that even though a lot of content by 360 filmmakers in the journalism space involves documenting issues in the Middle East and Africa, little content has been made by Arab or African filmmakers themselves. This is a critical tenet behind Contrast's My People, Our Stories initiative, where we train and equip storytellers in the global South. We were hoping to both support new and emerging talent, grow our network of 360 video filmmakers, and allow people to document stories from their own communities in their own voice. For our first initiative, we trained 8 Arab and African filmmakers to create their first 360 video. This initiative did not only create 8 strong 360 films, which were successfully distributed on Al Jazeera's social channels, but they were also curated for a VR installation in Romania. Thus far, we've taken My People, Our Stories to South Sudan, Brazil, Jordan, and Yemen. Yet I still have to ask myself and my team, what about the audience? We're not making these videos exclusively for a Western or English-speaking audience. So how do we ensure that our videos engage with a diverse audience? One of the things we've learned is that each audience has unique needs. For example, within the Middle East, reaching a wide audience online means understanding issues such as internet speed and penetration. A lot of these nuances are already being addressed by industry leaders within these countries. For example, a video producer with a Libyan channel shares that they typically upload videos on Facebook in lower resolutions and take all of the important information in the video and include it in the social copy, so that those who couldn't watch the video could still learn from the information. I bring this up because it speaks to the responsibility we have to make sure that the technologies we use are accessible to wider audiences. In addition to distribution, we also need to think about technology and its responsibility. What do I mean by the responsible use of technology? How is it unique to any other responsibilities we have as journalists and storytellers? A lot of VR experiences are preoccupied with point of view, which I think can be irresponsible. This approach carries the notion that somehow seeing a rape from the perspective of a woman who was raped and the rapist were able to understand things differently. This echoes the idea of a middle ground, which writer Tayari Jones notably argues against in Time magazine last month, where she said, "There is nothing inherently virtuous about being neither here nor there. Buried in this is a false equivalency of ideas, what you might call the good people on both sides phenomena." Just because technology allows us to show different points of view or take someone to a location in a developing country or conflict zone doesn't always mean that we should. Responsible technology should begin with the understanding that how technology is used can cause harm too. On the other hand, responsibility is not just about the kinds of stories or experiences we create. We also have a responsibility to make sure the technology is accessible to underrepresented communities, that they have the power to tell these stories using these mediums too. When we created Oil in Our Creeks about the Shell oil spill in a Nigerian village, the majority of our team consisted of Nigerians, whose backgrounds informed their investment into the story, as well as fueled their drive to use VR as a tool to bring the story to an international platform. The film was co-produced by a Nigerian writer, with production assistance by Sustainability International, a Nigerian nonprofit working in the country. We also worked with a Nigerian classical composer on the score and partnered with a Nigerian creative agency to screen the film at a public park with headsets for people in Lagos. Another aspect of accessibility, especially with regards to wearables, is for whose bodies are those technologies created for. It's almost impossible for me to get a headset on over my head wrap, so I have to watch most VR experiences in the confines of my home after I take off my head wrap. We experienced the same challenge when we screened our films for people in Nigeria, South Sudan, and other African countries. While we were able to share the knowledge and techniques of VR production with these people, many couldn't get the headset to fit over their hair, head wraps, or turbans. The technology wasn't created with us in mind. Recently at a panel at the new school in New York City, I was asked by an educator from Harlem, why should we be teaching kids how to use 360 cameras when we have so many more critical issues to address? It's an excellent and powerful question that I think about a lot. And the way I rationalize it is that we need to reclaim our narratives in order to heal and recover from the injustices and the trauma. An outsider won't wait to tell your story until your community has dealt with its critical issues. How these stories are told create a legacy way beyond the immediate coverage. And as people of color, we need to see storytelling not as something that can be dealt with later, but something pertinent in the now that is essential to our existence. As I've mentioned before, storytelling that incorporates these principles undoes a one-directional model and creates new multi-directional models. They also make storytelling more active. This is what technology makes possible. I want to conclude by talking about a new AR and VR project we're developing at Contrast, Still Here, which explores mass incarceration and gentrification through the experience of a Black woman from Harlem who has just gotten out of prison after a 14-year sentence. In developing the story, our foundational intention is how do we make the story for people who know the story already? By that I mean, how do we make the story follow the principle for us, by us? A story that is both meant for the community it depicts, yet is also relevant to a wider audience. We're still in the early stages, but we already know that this is a multi-layered process. It involves people we work with on the production side, from the writers to the researchers to community liaisons who will play an active role in developing the story. It also fundamentally involves us challenging ourselves to create an experience that someone who knows Harlem intimately can still enter and feel engaged rather than alienated. That is certainly not the only justice needed when covering stories about mass incarceration and gentrification, but it's a start. Community-based stories are hardly limited to immersive or digital media, but technology does create possibilities to reimagine multi-layered stories. It's almost impossible and perhaps unfruitful to disentangle storytelling and journalism from technology, as online consumption becomes the preferred method globally for information and entertainment. Technology has become the medium for how stories are shared, as well as how layers are added to storytelling, and ultimately how these stories are distributed. So today, rather than offering a step-by-step guideline of how to create authentic and diverse stories, I will end with the same question I started with. Who are our stories really for? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zahra. I think you're going to keep on using this microphone. Okay, let me first get you some water. And before, I'm going to ask the audience to ask their questions if they have. I want to ask the audience a question first, just to get an idea of who you are, so we can understand who we're telling this story for. Who of you is working in immersive media? Okay, I would say a third, maybe not even. And who of you is a maker, a filmmaker or a writer? Okay, that's like a third to a half. And who of you is a decision maker, an editor, producer? Okay, that's even less. Okay. Is there anything else you would like to know from the audience? No, that's good. Okay, thanks. So, is there anyone who has a question? We have a microphone, so if you raise your hand, there'll be a mic coming up. And you have the opportunity to ask questions all through the conversation, even when we are talking. I have a little bit trouble with the light, so if I don't see you right away, just shout, whistle to get attention. Oh, thanks for giving the light. Is there anyone who has a question right now? Go ahead.
Hi. My question is that I didn't raise my hand when you asked that who is from immersive media, who has worked with. I most of the time work with the traditional methods, basically using normal camera. So my question is that when you were saying your team or you have been to different places and like showing these kind of videos to those your target audiences, basically. What is the difference between, for example, the videos which Al Jazeera has been producing, the normal videos, and this like VR or AR related videos? Don't you think that this restricts your target audiences as well? And it's difficult to kind of, for example, if you have a 2 headset or 3 headset, and it restricts you from like reaching to the wider audiences?
Absolutely. I mean, the reason we do it in 360 format is because I'm working for a studio whose mandate is to look at new and emerging tech and use that for our storytelling. So that's the reason we're shooting our videos in VR and 360. We're aware that most of our audience does not have access to a headset, and that's the reason why we'll upload all of our videos to Facebook, YouTube, Vimeo, Twitter. You can't watch it. It's definitely not as immersive as watching it in a VR headset, but they're still able to see it in 360.
Any other questions? Like I said, I'm just a moderator, but this time I'm really happy to talk to you, Zarah. I had the privilege to have a conversation as a preparation for this day. And I know a lot about diversity in storytelling, diversity in media, but I was really struck by the profoundness of your thinking about this. I think I've never met anyone in the industry who had such a 360 perspective on what it takes to have diverse stories. So I would love to dive into that with you. Thank you for your presentation. I think it was very insightful to get an idea of what you're doing. Your case for diversity, I think, goes way further than it very often happens. Very often there's an economical case. We have to be diverse because we need a broader audience or we need a bigger market. There's very often a social case. There's a sense of representation in media. And also because funds ask for it more and more. But you have a very explicit other case, and it's a case of justice and even a case of healing. How did that develop? Where did it come from?
It's really interesting. People tell me that you speak so much about diversity all the time, and you talk about racism, and you talk about all of those things. Don't you get tired about it? And I tell them, I was like, well, it's not something that I can disentangle from myself because this is my experience. I grew up in a country that was colonized by the British for 200 years. Our culture, our policies, our law, the way we think, the way we treat each other in our own country is very much shaped by our history in colonization. I moved to the US when I was 18, and I moved from Mumbai to Missouri, which was in the Midwest. It was predominantly white. Most people had not seen anybody like me or met anybody with my background. Didn't know what a Muslim person looks like in person. Everything they knew about Muslims was shaped by what they had consumed in the media. And so I faced a lot of obstacles and a lot of Islamophobia when I moved, and I was 18. It was something that greatly impacted me. And it continued to happen because I work in an industry that is predominantly white. Most American newsrooms, and especially people at the top who are leading these places, are white people. And so constantly found myself having to work much harder to tell them, well, the way you're telling the story is not right. You need to explore different perspectives. So on my day-to-day, when I'm going through airports, it's something that is so present in my life that I don't know how not to talk about it, and how not for it to impact my work. And so I think that's where this idea of justice and healing, because I use storytelling for that very purpose in my life.
I totally recognized it when you told about this, and also it immediately brought up another issue, because when you talk about diverse perspectives, it means that you are inviting filmmakers or creators to have their own perspective in order to have those stories. But I think the internalization of racism and the internalization of having a, let's say, Eurocentric perspective or even a white perspective, it is so much common because we're part of culture, we're raised in a certain way, we're used to certain stories. And every single filmmaker I've talked to of color knows this phenomenon, that you're very used. I'm a documentary maker myself, and I also know this phenomenon that you're very used to have this dominant lens always. So you always have this perception of who your audience is, and also that you have to explain a lot of things, like the experience, for instance, you're talking about the experience of racism or what it means to be a person of color. How do you go around that? How do you stimulate people to unlearn that perspective?
You know, that's a really great question, and it's actually really hard. You have to do that every single day.
Mm-hmm.
Just because I'm up on the stage, I'm advocating for diversity and representation and for these, you know, for making room for different perspectives, doesn't mean that that's how I conduct myself every single day. It's not true, because I had all of my education in the United States. I've worked only in the US and in Western newsrooms. I am very much a product of that. I understand that in order to get a grant or to get into a film festival, your story needs to be appealing to the people who are choosing your films to get into those places. And so it's something that's very conscious, something that you have to do every single day. I do that exercise with my team every single time we're telling a story. We're like, who is the story being created for? What is the message that you're trying to give through the stories? Are we perpetuating stereotypes and prejudices that, you know, we've learned unconsciously and also just imbibed in ourselves? And so that's something that, you know, is a work in progress. And the way I surround myself with a lot of people who think about these issues critically. I'm really lucky to have some, you know, amazing men and women in my life who keep me in check and who are discussing about these things and are engaged in issues like that. So I think that really helps too.
Mm-hmm. And that also, I think, defines how you assemble your team. I know it's one of your bullets that if you want to have diversity, you have to hire a diverse team. I can imagine that very often it is said, we cannot find the qualified people to execute the work. How do you think about that?
Yeah, that's actually, you know, a lot of white people tell me that. They're like, we find it really hard to attract people of color to join our team. And I was like, well, I hired a team that's entirely all diverse from different parts of the world. I didn't have problem attracting people of color or diverse people to work for me. The onus is on you to reach out to them. It's not on them to come to you. And also the other thing that I do truly believe in is that skills can be transferred. I know that if somebody has a perspective or an experience that is unique to that person and we need that part of our team, I can teach a person how to edit a video. I can teach a person how to storyboard, but I can't teach people's experiences to others. That is inherently part of who you are.
And also should be defined as a quality that somebody brings in to a team. Yeah. Instead of a handicap, so to speak. What is the environment that you're working in? So you talk about hiring a diverse team, including the constant consciousness of the perspective that you're mediating through your story, but also the idea about who your audience is. And you call that creating an ecosystem. Can you elaborate a little bit on that and how important that is?
Yeah, absolutely. The first step is hiring a diverse team. The second step is making sure that they're not just an image, but they're actually a voice part of your production. It's really easy to hire people of color, but then just let them serve as tokens on your team because that's what you need. And so I think we really try, we're really aware about this, and we try as much as we can through every production that we do, that the people that we're bringing onto for that production are part of the core team. They are co-producers. They are people writing the storyboard. They're people who are working on the animations. They're not just our fixers and our drivers. Mm-hmm. And also with My People, Our Stories, that's essentially what we've been able to do. We're just facilitating the storytelling, but the storytelling comes entirely from the people that have that are our participants and that have the cameras and that get to keep it and continue to pitch stories to us or to other people. The idea is, how do we let them speak in their own voice rather than us telling them, this is the story, we want to hear from you.
Mm-hmm. There's a question.
Yeah, at first, thank you for your powerful message. Found it really interesting. You were talking about newsrooms in America and other choices they can make while producing stories. Can you give maybe like 2 examples that you saw a story from a specific perspective, that if you would have been in charge, what you have chosen, what you would have done differently?
Yeah, I mean, this is a conversation that's happening a lot within America. I think the election of Trump and how the liberal media reacted, quote-unquote liberal media on the coast reacted to it, they were really surprised that Trump was elected president. Well, that happened because there is not just the lack of racial diversity, but also economic diversity in your newsrooms. They didn't realize, well, there are people that actually espouse that belief because of because of the challenges and the sufferings of also white people in the Midwest and other parts of the poor parts of the country. So I think that we're becoming more aware about that within America, but I still think the racial diversity is something that is neglected on constantly. An example would be when Ferguson happened in the U.S. And there were black people that were they called it looting, quote unquote looting. Mm-hmm. They called it violence by the black people when they went into shops and took food from supermarkets. But when the same thing happened in Florida after the hurricane, that was considered survival. Mm-hmm. That was considered, well, these are people who don't have food, they're going to the shops. They're doing essentially the same thing that the black people did in Ferguson, but the way it was framed, it was completely different. I mean, look at every single mass shooting that happens in the US. When the mass shooting is done by a white male, we call them unstable, mentally ill. The moment that person's race changes, that person becomes a terrorist. Mm-hmm. And it's surprising that it's still the narrative that we continue to use, even though there is awareness and there are people that are asking for those things to change.
And I think also a real significant difference is that when there's a mass shooting by a white male, it's very individualized. It's like a lone wolf, a single person, instead of...
Exactly. It was just that one person that has a problem.
A representative of a collective or a group. I think there was another question.
Sorry, no mind.
Oh. Okay, up there, and then also a question here. Hi.
My question is for basically for filmmakers. You talk about perspective, and a lot of the challenges in VR is to move away from the point of view of someone for you to feel something. Mm-hmm. Can you maybe share other experiences that place the camera somewhere else, and what does that tell in a VR experience?
Yeah. Did everyone hear that? I think so, huh? Okay, great.
I do think, though, the point of view experience is probably the most powerful in VR. At least that's what I've experienced. I personally don't mind the point of view experience, being able to see something from the point of view of someone. What I was indicating in my talk was that the idea that every single point of view needs to be depicted in order for you to have an equal experience. There are experiences that show what a rape looks like from the perspective of the woman that was raped and the man that was raping her. And I think that is where it becomes problematic. You don't need to show of a family separation on the border. You don't need to show the point of view of the family being separated and the officer that is inflicting the injustice. This idea that we need to be showing all of the different perspectives in VR in order to tell you the story, that is what I think can tread into the territory of irresponsibility.
There's a question here.
Hi. As somebody that works in media here in Holland, and I also work with American companies, often what I feel when I pitch stories, often like media companies are interested, but a lot of times they don't want to have the pitch because they say that it won't be understood. So especially in Holland, like when I go to like bigger publications, they say like, yeah, we really like your perspective, really like your idea, but we don't think that Dutch audience will understand it. What do you feel like me as a freelancer could do to like prove them that they should actually publish? Because a lot of times I feel like, you know, like I cannot change the story that much that it will be understood by a, you know, a wide perspective in a way.
Yeah, I mean, that's a common challenge, I would say, you know, and I think that happens because the people that are signing off on those projects, you know, at the end of the day, we're looking for a perspective that fits, you know, the predominant narrative. We're not looking for something that challenges that or provides you an alternative. What do you do in that case? That's tough. I mean, I think you need to find publications that would be willing to have that perspective. You know, try to build a network of people who share similar experiences like yours, or share your perspective, and try to find different contacts. I do think that, you know, we need, as people of color, we need more publications that are run by or that are managed by us in positions of power. That's the only way we're going to be able to bring those ideas and perspectives at the forefront. And you're seeing some of that changes happening, at least, and like I said, I can only speak from the American perspective because that's where my experience is. You're seeing, for example, a lot of film festivals hiring a lot of diversity more in their programming, and that's reflective of the content that is now being showcased. So I think we need to be advocating for more diverse people in positions of power. I think that is when the real change happens.
Are there any more questions? I want to continue on this last point that you're making about the changing face of the industry. You talk about the American context or the context in the US predominantly. What kind of changes do you see, and how sustainable do you think this is?
You know, unfortunately, I hate to be a downer, but I feel the changes are a lot slower than what's happening in the society. Mm-hmm. I think, and you know, it's sad because news is supposed to be, news is supposed to be something that's dynamic and that changes according to the needs of the people and what's happening in the society. But the American news industry, at least, isn't. You know, you're not seeing that happen. Mm-hmm. There's been a lot more, I think, awareness about gender equality, especially post the Me Too movement, yes, and as the Me Too movement continues. But I think that the racial diversity issue still hasn't been addressed as much as it should in the US.
Why do you think that is? Because people are quite eager to adopt gender issues and to work with that, but issues dealing culture, ethnicity, religion, they are kind of, people have more trouble tackling those. Yeah. Do you have an idea about that?
The idea of having true diversity and representation means for people who are already in existing positions of power to give up some of their power and make more room for alternative spaces. So while theoretically we like the idea that we need to have more diversity, that means that people who already hold that power need to give up some of theirs. And that's always really hard, which is what you're seeing. You'll hear a lot of people talk about that on panels and advocate for that in their writings, but when it actually comes to work, you're not seeing that happening because it means them stepping aside to make room for somebody else. Mm-hmm. And I think that is the core of the issue for why we're not seeing more of that happen.
Mm-hmm. How could it, is there a case where it could benefit for everyone? Because, for instance, the example, I know the last journalist who was speaking, that he will have trouble selling his story in the Netherlands but get a lot of opportunities elsewhere in the world. So we also lose people if we don't do it. So there's also in it for everyone to really get this in more speed.
Absolutely, and the economic case for diversity has been made again and again and again, and we understand it's good business, and we understand, especially for the news industry, you have the lowest trust in media ever, or globally. Mm-hmm. The reason that's happening is because clearly there's an issue within. We understand these issues. You know, it's people working in the news industry are smart, but like I said, it is about power, and it's about who holds power. is why we're not seeing more action.
If you don't have any questions, I'll go ahead, because you talked a lot about technology and the possibilities of immersive media to tackle all these issues. Can you elaborate a little bit more about the possibilities of immersive technologies, but also of the obstacles or maybe the challenges?
Yeah. And while it might seem in my talk that I think that there are so many things problematic about it, I really do believe it's incredibly powerful, which is why I'm sitting here today and I'm working in this medium. So I really do believe that immersive technology and VR and AR and all of these new things that you're seeing in the market have the potential to tell stories in a much more layered way than we've had before. The opportunity to be able to immerse somebody in somebody else's experiences or reality actually has a value to it. Before we work on any story, we think about what is the benefit of actually telling the story in VR? Are we adding something more that maybe a photo gallery or a linear video would not have done? And, for example, when we made the decision to cover the Rohingya refugee crisis in VR, for us it was important because part of the Rohingya story is also being able to experience what those people are currently going through and their living conditions and the lack of hygiene and basic health facilities. And so being able to see how they live in those refugee camps, those incredibly cramped refugee camps, was an important part of the story. And we thought that that wouldn't come through just in a photo gallery or in a way that it would in VR, when you can actually take somebody there while explaining the issue and being able to show them what the current reality is on the ground. So I think and what we did is we teamed up with Amnesty International, which to me was really interesting. It was the first time I had actually done this. We teamed up with Amnesty International, and Amnesty took the video to members of the UN Security Council because they were the ones that were actually making a decision about policy around the Rohingya refugees. And I was not participating in the meetings, I was just witnessing them. And it was, most of the people in the UN Security Council who were working on that issue, none of them had been to Bangladesh or had actually seen the Rohingya people in person, because Bangladesh is one issue in their portfolio of issues that they're dealing with. And so they were really grateful that they could actually experience the issue in this way. It was the most intimate portrayal they had. And of course, I don't know if that actually impacted their decision in any way, but it was powerful. So I do think that there is room for us to tell better and different kinds of stories in this.
And I think it's really interesting because me as an audience looking at those productions, it also made me realize how somehow I always kind of prepare myself when I see stuff to be cautious about the kind of story that I get and to be very aware of the lens that things are told through. But the level of considerations of all the aspects that you're building into the production, I think it really tells in the stories you tell, besides from being at a real broad spectrum of stories, but also the kind of very intimate storytelling. You really feel that people have an understanding of what they're doing.
Yeah, and I would hope so. I don't know if that's, there are any facts to prove what you're saying, but the way I would say that we've been successful is that we've been able to create a really tight community of people who look to us and who want to work with us. And the people that we train, part of our training initiatives, continue to pitch to us stories. They're working with other news organizations. And I think that, they constantly invite us back in order to work with them to tell more stories. And I think that, to me, that building that trust with the community, people looking to us to help them create this kind of media, I see that as, being a success. It's one thing that I realized initially is that if I really wanted to do this kind of storytelling and to do it with this particular lens, I need to stop seeking validation from mainstream institutions. Because if you're going to seek validation by saying that, well, I'm only successful if I get into an X top-tier festival, and that's how I know my work is good, well, then you're going to have to create stories that they're going to want to watch. And that was not the idea and the intention behind doing this work. It's not seeking validation from the dominant perspective or the mainstream.
But meanwhile, you are nurturing talent. So how, and I think that's really important because people have to start somewhere in order to get a career in filmmaking. How do you, what happens with the talents that you're selecting, you're training, they make a production? Is that community also evolving? Do you keep track on them?
Absolutely. I mean, informally, we are just a team of 6 people. So it's not, we don't have a lot of resources. We don't have a lot of manpower. Informally, we keep in touch because the way we keep in touch is that most of them are connected to all of my producers on social media. We get updates from them. They'll send us pitches for us to look at if they're submitting it to someplace else. For the Bertha Fund, we got in touch with a few of the people that we worked with, and we encouraged them to apply. And we told them that anybody who applies, we'll actually review their application to make sure that it is, it meets all of the guidelines that they're looking for at IDFA. So those are things that we do sort of to encourage them, to help them develop more. But it's all really informal and ad hoc.
Okay. Something else that I was interested in is how, because you talked about the benefits of immersive media, how much of that approach that you're having is also applicable for linear documentaries? I think because most people still work in linear storytelling. I think
it is a lot, it is totally applicable to all other forms of storytelling. In fact, a lot of my inspiration comes from linear work. This idea of creating stories by us and for us has been done extensively in other forms of media, and more recently has been picked up by Hollywood. So if you see "Sorry to Bother You" by Boots Riley, he's a black rapper. You have "Random Acts of Flyness" on HBO, currently premiering by Terrence Nance. All of these, you suddenly see this resurgence in art and cinema where it is told from the perspective, well, this is actually created for us, and you can find meaning in it and get a window into our story, but we're not creating this specifically for you. So it's happening. It is becoming more acceptable in the mainstream in the US and within Hollywood and indie films and things like that. So I think that what I'm advocating for is not groundbreaking or not new. It is something that has been explored over time.
Mm-hmm. And by accident, I think I'm even thinking about Atlanta by Glover.
David Glover.
Yeah, that as a byproduct, it appears to attract a more diverse audience than initially targeted.
Exactly.
So, and also becomes economically successful, etc. But I think in a way you are quite privileged, so to say, that you work within a organization that has diversity and the propelling of a different perspective in its core of its DNA, so to speak. And you are in a position where you can hire a very diverse team. You're in a position where you can create the ecosystem that you think is needed. What if you work in an organization like most people do who don't have that in the DNA? Where can they start? What can they do?
That's really hard. The 2 places that I worked before this were incredibly challenging. I was working for 2 American companies, 2 American newsrooms, and I finally decided that I had to leave because I just felt very stifled and challenged, and I think the difficulty of it to create that change felt so insurmountable or so slow that I didn't feel like I was exhausted being part of the system. And so I decided, well, this is not working for me. I need to go to a place that's actually happy to have me and my perspectives. I think sometimes it's possible to work within systems and change them internally, but you need to have a lot of really strong allies. And when you don't see you have those allies, then at some point you have to decide, well, it's not working. I need to step out because your mental health, your self-esteem, your confidence, that is way more important than the work that you're doing, because you can't do that work if you don't preserve your dignity and your confidence and all of those things. So, I decided to step out of those roles, and I did hold pretty prominent positions too, but the people that were above me just weren't strong enough allies for me to do the work that I wanted to do.
So you went to a place where you could find that. Okay.
Yeah.
Great. So if any of you think this is a really important topic, look for an environment where you can thrive and achieve that. I think we're about to go to the end, but I do have, if you have questions, just you have time to ask that. But meanwhile, I'll have two questions that kind of wraps up everything that you say. Where do you think, with your experience in this field, where do you think both main topics will go to? The issue of diversity, because I think it's everywhere in the cultural industry, in film also, it's very much in the forefront of everyone's mind. Where do you see it going in the next few years? What kind of developments do you see?
Yeah. I mean, it truly really depends on how many people get on board and are supportive of these kind of issues. And I'm sitting here talking to Tessa, but Tessa in her own right is an incredible filmmaker. And I was so excited when you were going to moderate the panel because I looked you up and I saw the work. And, I was so happy that there was somebody else that was trying to change narratives and, the way stories are being told. And I think it's not just people like you and me who are talking about these things and creating work, but I do truly think that we'll have change when the white people come on board with us and support us and propel our voice forward and elevate those other people that have been marginalized and underrepresented for so long, because the power still lies with them. It's not with us. And I think that change will happen when we get different groups together. It's the same thing, right? Like, you don't need to advocate to women about gender equality. You need to advocate that to men, because women already get it. We understand that we need to be paid equal. So it's the same thing. I think it's the same idea, even when it comes to representation and diversity. So I think in your communities and your workplaces, I think it depends on who you're able to get on board to support that.
Okay, I hope you made a strong case for people to do that. And the other thing is that I'm really curious about your perspective on how immersive media will develop. And especially around the globe, and especially in areas where people have little access to technology.
Yeah, I work in VR, but we haven't seen mass adoption of headsets specifically. I can talk about that, and of course, then with volumetric and the interactive VR, it becomes even harder because you need an entire setup with sensors that can track and things like that. So I haven't seen mass adoption of VR headsets, even though tech companies have been really pushing for it. So I'm not optimistic that it's going to be mainstream. I do think it has specific areas that it will be continued to be used in. For example, festivals, events, premium experiences that people will pay for. So I think it will continue to develop, but the major development will not happen in the mainstream. It will happen within a fringe audience, and that makes it harder for places with lesser internet penetration for that to happen.
But when it happens, the impact will be great. Does anyone have a closing question? No, then I would love to thank you for being with us, and thank you for sharing your knowledge and your insight. And I hope we all are able to look at the productions of Contrast, because it really gives you a different insight in the world we're living in. Thank you so much, Zarah.
Thank you so much, Tessa.